Okay,
Hey. Class is started.
here's what we're doing. We're gonna go over the use of force. In this, our terminal performance objective is given an encounter with a non-compliant or violent subject. Officer will apply an objectively reasonable level of force to stabilize the situation in accordance with the state, federal, and statutes. Current case law. Our enabling objectives are review constitutional standards for the use of force, apply a review of statutory and case law, the use of force cases, and identify force options, display the situation in which their deployment may be reasonable. We also need to explain the need to articulate clearly the facts related to the use of force. Any questions? Okay. Our constitutional standards. Regardless of public perception in recent cases, there's been no shift in legal standards related to the use of force. Excessive force is force that is not considered reasonable. Over 90% of excessive force complaints are unfounded. This is going to be coming from Graham v. Connor, Tennessee v. Garner, Scott v. Harris, and the 4th, 8th, and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Now, our 4th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it's the seizure of a person. You got to either have an application of force, however slight it is, or submission to the officer's show of their authority. Now, you showing your authority, is that going to be a use of force? No, it's not. But if you stop their, freedom of movement, of course it is. Now, force may be reasonable to be used to, if you're trying to compel somebody to comply with your lawful commands, overcome physical restraint by the subject, prevent escape or restrain from subject to purposes of an arrest on probable cause, detain or restrain the subject during an investigatory stop based on articulable reasonable suspicion, or achieve other legitimate law enforcement purposes when mere present verbal commands fail. Now, factors on the 8th and 14th Amendment claims excessive force. There's got to be a need for the force being used. Now, you also have to have the need for the amount of force used. Also, the extent of injuries, the extent of threat to the safety of other inmates, and efforts may temper in the severity of the response. In other words, you've got to go and there's got to be a need for force. Just because somebody's not cooperating, is there a need for force? Not always. But also the amount of force used. If somebody's just being, I don't want to go with you, you're just going to go up and tase them? No, you don't want to do that. That's excessive force. Then once you do that, you go look at the extent of the injuries and see if there's how serious the injuries are. Now, our justification, where the defendant raises affirmative defense and justification and testifies the same, the burden of the state is to disprove the defense beyond all reasonable doubt. So, what's that mean? Whose burden is on? It's our burden to go and prove that the use of force was objectively reasonable, right?
Correct.
Absolutely. Now, these statutes, these are where our cases come from, and our case law comes from, is 16.320, 321, 324.2, 17.420, 15.12, 71, and 17.752. I'm not going to go over each of these right now. If you'd like, you can get with me afterwards and we'll go over them. Now, when it pertains to vehicle pursuits, you have like Scott v. Harris, where they had the one in Coweta County. That's when they started bringing vehicle pursuits in there, because you have the use of deadly force and like the pit maneuvers and things like that. You have to be able to justify a use of force complaint to execute one of those. Now, it says where the action of an officer is reasonable using due regard, the pursuit cannot be proximate cause of the damage resulting from the pursuit. So, it's laying the burden back onto the violator, right? Because if the violator wouldn't have run, wouldn't have had the issue to begin with. Now, when it comes to the grand jury, the officer must be given 20 days notice. That's if the case is against you. Not just to go and, we had that in the last class, talk about going to grand jury, because some days we don't even get a week's notice. But anyway, testimony must be transcribed and be released if the indictment or presentment is not recommended. Officer statement is subject to cross-examination and rebuttal. Means you can testify at your own grand jury. And civil grand jury may review cases to determine if there's sufficient question of lawfulness of the officer's actions. Now, there's two types of force that we look at. You have your deadly force, which is likely to or can cause death or great bodily injury, or non-deadly force, which is not likely to cause death or great bodily injury. Some of your non-deadly force options are your hands-on control techniques, where you do is your control or takedowns and your active countermeasures. Your chemical agents, which could be like pepper spray, things of that. Impact weapons, which we don't really use around here. Electronic control devices, our tasers, X26, M26, X26Ps. And you must be able to articulate the need for the force or control to restrain the subject. It means you have to be able to explain yourself, why are you going to use this? And once the subject stops restraining, the officer must stop applying all force. Now, as far as deadly force is concerned, it falls up under 16321 and 17420. Now here, 17420 authorizes the use of deadly force by a sheriff or peace officer who is appointed or employed by or someone in compliance with Post Title Act 35, Chapter 8. When he or she reasonably believes the subject possesses a deadly weapon, the subject poses an immediate threat of physical violence to the officer or others, or there's probable cause to believe that the suspected felon has committed a crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of physical harm. Now, here's your deadly force options. You have your knives, your guns, any types of strikes to the head, Motorola included. Couldn't resist, right? I'm sorry. Patrol vehicle strikes, grappling, wrestling, martial arts. That's a lot of things we have to deal with now, especially dealing with Columbus and all the military. And any available object or method. Now, are verbal warnings required? Absolutely not. It's only when feasible. If you have enough time to give a verbal warning, give it. But if you don't, nothing says you have to give verbal warnings. Now, some special circumstances. You have your age, sex, size, skill level, prior knowledge of offenses, multiple officers and suspects, intensity of physical altercation, and environmental conditions. Now, something I went over in like the last class. Think about it, if you go and you have somebody my age going into something and you have somebody like Lieutenant Collier, who's going to have the advantage, me or him? Me. Now, same scenario. You have somebody like me, Captain Price. Captain Price is going to have it all day and twice on Sunday.
I don't agree with this.
Now, skill level. You know, do somebody has some kind of special skill level we don't know about? Jiu-jitsu, karate, all that kind of good stuff. So that's a lot of things that you got to think about. Now, some other things for proactive use of force, you generally use less force. When you're being proactive, you're generally going to use less force because you're able to take the subject into custody quicker. And it gives less injury to the suspect and less injury to the officer, so it gives you better options for later. Now, pre-attack indicators, you can have clenching of the fist, glaring, it's, you know, what is it, 1,000-mile stare as they say, flanking, them staring at your weapons, them sitting there just posturing towards you, abnormal breathing. Now, when it goes to reporting, you want to go and what we're looking for is objective facts. You know, we're all investigators, that's what we look for. We look for objective facts and personal perception of the officer. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Right? Now, it should be written in chronological order as the events unfold, and they also must be analyzed using an objectable, reasonable standard, and they've got to be accurate and complete. Can't leave anything out. More details are better. So it goes into your articulation. You got to have your don't have the conclusion versus facts. So, for your examples that put up, I handcuffed the guy, or I handcuffed and frisked the suspect for officer safety. That's nothing. That's a bad example. How about I handcuffed and frisked the suspect because the bulge in his jacket, he would not keep his hands out of his pocket after being told to do so. That gives you a little bit more articulation on why you went a little bit further. Now, set the scene for the context of the event. You know, what was the situation that brought you to there? Establish your date, time, and your authority. Give it your physical setting as far as what's going on, what kind of house, dwelling, anything you're coming up to, whether it's a traffic stop. Identify who all was there, to include any of the witnesses. Now, what was your perception of the situation going on. You know, what was your ideas? How many people were present? How were you, you know, what were you feeling? What was your initial ideas? Then their physical appearance. What'd they look like? You know, did you pull up, they have glare in their eye? Did they already look like they were ready to fight or had been, you know, fighting, things of that nature? Then put it into a sequence of events that occurred. Exactly what force was used and how it was used, and any type of injuries that were sustained to you or the suspect. Make photographs of them, document them, do it the day of, the day after, and so on. And any other damaged property. If you broke a chair, or they broke a chair, or whatever during it, you want to notate that, because that's, you know, important for your report, but also it has to be replaced. Now, any consequences to the incident, you want to document, catalog physical evidence collected, include copies of the incident and arrest reports. Now, here's what we basically discussed in just a short period. You want to review your constitutional standards of the use of force. Apply or review the statutory case law to the force cases, and identify the force options, explain the situations in which their deployment may be reasonable. And explain the need to articulate clearly the facts related to the use of force. Do you have any questions? Okay. Now we're going to go to the other one, because there's two of these. There's two.
Someone say two?
Two.
Dos.
All right, under the Governor standard, as you know, we now have to do de-escalation as well as use of deadly force. So our terminal performance objective for de-escalation is given an encounter with a non-compliant and non-violent subject. The officer will employ de-escalation techniques to stabilize the situation in accordance with the concepts and include the GPSTC police legitimacy, procedural justice, and community relations curricula. Our enabling objectives, we're going to define the de-escalation as it applies to law enforcement. We're going to identify signs and symptoms of an emotionally disturbed person and compare and contrast the benefits and disadvantages of de-escalation. We're also going to identify the factors in the de-escalation and attempted de-escalation and describe the techniques for de-escalation in potentially dangerous situations and identify some of the pitfalls from de-escalation. All right. De-escalation is defined as the art of being able to reduce the danger and tension in a crisis situation where tension is in an elevated state. We've all been there. One time or another, we've all been upset, tension's been high. All right? So, our purpose is to enable a person in crisis to regain control of the situation to the degree that they're able to resolve and reduce the stress to a manageable level where they're able to function. It requires effective communication and skills apart from the deputy seeking to intervene and mediate the crisis. Now, some of our successful uses in de-escalation could be in a mental health crisis, personal crisis, developmental issues, disabilities, victims and witnesses, arrestees, and third parties. At some point in our career, we've dealt with at least one of those, if not every one of them. Now, emotionally persons defined, you have demonstrating symptoms of mental illness that could be under the influence. Experience medical problems and experience situational stress. Now, emotionally disturbed persons may or may not have mental illness or developmental disability. They could just have an addictive disease and may or may not have a history of unusual behavior. Now, some verbal cues that when you're talking to them, they have illogical thoughts, unusual speech patterns, verbal hostility, or an excitement. Behavioral cues could be physical appearance, body movement, seeing, smelling, hearing things that cannot be confirmed. Lack of emotional response, inappropriate emotional reactions, and cause an injury to self, nonverbal or expressions of sadness or grief. Now, some environmental cues could be decorations, waste matter or trash and just throwing out things, are having childish objects. Now, if you want to get an extra reading assignment, just kind of follow up with this. There's a website you can go to and read up on it. Now, some more things to consider. Sir.
What's an EDP?
Emotional disturbed person.
We call them Williamsons.
It's a good name for
Some factors to consider. We
it.
have
Still here, ain't I? That proves that.
We have medical conditions, physical limitations, language and communications barrier, drug interaction, influence substances, mental impairment, developmental disability, and behavioral crisis. Now, some of the factors that you got to keep in concern. Your number one thing that you got to do at all scenes is make sure it's safe. Make sure you're safe, because if you're not safe, the scene's not safe, and it go haywire real quick. So you have your pre-attack indicators, your presence of weapons, distance, presence of victims and bystanders, backup and lack of backup. And that's going to be something more that would happen around here, is not so much your backup, but your lack of backup, because think about how large our county is and how few deputies we have working it. Then you have your containment area, time, and environment. You know, when you look at the time, we think of daytime because that's normally when we work. What about when you're getting that 3 o'clock in the morning phone call of an emotionally disturbed person who's been up all day on a binge and drinking and everything else? Not only that you're tired, but they're tired too. So that kind of throws it into a bigger loop. All right. Some benefits: it allows your adrenaline their adrenaline to subside, less chance of any type of injury. It's increasing the officer's safety. You know, when they're calm, they're less likely to hurt you. Wouldn't you think? I think so. Allows for more police resources to arrive. You're buying yourself that time. And it could reduce liability and complaints. Because where does that liability and complaint come in is when you start to use force. Now, disadvantages: it may empower the subject because they may do the exact opposite of what you're working towards. It allows emotional and physical fatigue to set in and can make you become complacent. And at some point, our resources do run out. Now, when de-escalation isn't working, it can be threatening to harm you. The opportunity to transition to a force option, and you got to keep that in mind. It's never risk-free, but nothing is in our line of work. And you got to continually assess safety. Now, some of the hidden factors that you got to think about is your training, your equipment that you have. You know, what tools do you have at your availability? Your experiences that you've had throughout your career. And what kind of fitness are you in? You know, what kind of force options, if you do have to rely on that, can you do? You know, can you go on a 10-hour manhunt after them if they take off running in the woods? Now, when you're documenting, you want to say, I attempted to de-escalate the subject, but the environment was too, or the subject refused to engage. Or I stopped the de-escalating when. And just be very detailed, but that's something we harp on in every one of our classes. Why? Detailed reports make better reports. Now, your tactical disengagement. It's a temporary retreat. It creates the distance, gives them time to calm down, and gives you time to reassess what's going on. Plus, it gives you that chance to re-engage to try to de-escalate it in a different tactic. Plus, it gives you the option to use force if necessary. Now you have your empathy, which is effective communications involve empathy. Now, empathy is defined as the ability to put yourself in another's shoes, seeing their circumstances they see. A lot of things that we go to and have issues with, like domestics. Let's use that for example. We go to them all the time. People are like, I'm going through a divorce. Well, guess what? I'm sure somebody on every shift has been through one. They can empathize with them and say, I know what you're going through. Totally different than sympathy. Now, when communicating with a purpose person in crisis, it helps let them know that you're free to help them and you understand what they're thinking and feeling. And just like I said, it's different than sympathy. You want to be an active listener, ask open-ended questions. You know, listening to what they're trying to say and not just the words that they're saying. Now, as I said, active listening is the key to de-escalation. It's a fundamental communication skill, and it's honest effort to empathize and comprehend the message and understand the underlying emotions. It lowers your emotional response and establishes rapport with them. It also encourages your behavior change. You know, if you're sitting there dealing with a subject, if you're who's upset, if they're going and they think you're listening to them, they're going to calm down. One of the things I like to do is if they're talking loud, I like to talk quieter. Brings them down. Now, one thing you also want to think of is ask open-ended questions. Get them to where they're going and opening up to you and actually want to tell you more than just a closed-ended question. It allows them to get things off their chest and vent to you. Now, whenever I talk to somebody, I like to say, "Hey, I'm Mike Pitts." Not, "Hey, I'm Sergeant Pitts with Harris County Sheriff's Office." Why? Because I'm wanting to go and get that rapport going to where they're going to want to talk to me. Not so much befriend them, but let them know, hey, I'm listening to them. I'm willing to listen to them. Now, I statements, they convey that you're listening and understanding that you actually care. Meaning, I understand what you're going through. I sympathize with you, or I empathize with you. And you want to restate whatever it is they tell you. That lets them know that you're being an active listener. And you want to paraphrase it when you're restating it to them. Now, at any time, if you realize the de-escalation isn't working, let them know that you could be the only thing standing between them and whatever force is. It could be beneficial in the initial stages, but in the latter stages, it doesn't work as well. And it should be de-emphasized at the barrier to communication. So that's what you're saying is, I'm trying to work through it with you. And as we all know, citizens have their own biasness towards law enforcement. Mental disorders, they're clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental process underlying mental function. Mental disorders are usually associated with a significance, distress, and disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. Some things you want to think about: you want to talk slower, don't talk down to them. You want to talk on a level that they understand. You know, don't be using really big words. You know, yeah, you may have a college degree, but they only understand things on a third grade level, so you don't want to use really big words that they don't want to understand. You want to say things that they understand. And don't deceive them. Don't challenge them or tease or belittle. Now, as far as your ear module, this is something they like to talk about. You want to engage that person, gain their trust, focus on the physical health. Use you statements to communicate your observations. The A part of the ear module is you want to assess. Continuous process, gathering information, but officer safety is still our #1 issue. And always get your sources of information, any of their subjects, friends, anything you can, coworkers. The R to the ear module is resolve. You know, how are you going to resolve whatever's going on? Do you want to refer them? Do you want to just leave? You know, if you leave, and is that going to resolve it? If you want to calm it down? Do they need to be arrested? Do they need to be taken for mental health evaluation or medical treatments? I don't know what this is, but apparently I don't even know why it keeps coming up. All right. Now, as far as the loss module, what they go by is loss of reality. That's your L in the loss module. Your observable facts. You know, are they frightened, confused, difficult, having false belief, paranoid, or self-neglect? Your O is observable characteristics. Again, hostile, manipulative, impulsive, destructive, confrontational. Further, you have anxiety, physical discomfort, restlessness, and rapid speech. Also sad, emotional, They could have had a recent loss of a loved one, helplessness, withdrawal, and fatigue. Now, when you're dealing with angry or difficult citizens, and acknowledge that they're frustrated, show them empathy, apologize without accepting the blame for whatever, because it's not your fault, whatever's going on. Don't argue with them, give them some choices, and distance yourself from the negative and personalize the positive. Don't answer abusive questions, and minimize that subject's negative behavior. Rationalize with them, then leave. Some de-escalation pitfalls you want to avoid. You don't want to compromise your officer's safety ever. You don't want to rush into things, make rash decisions, or give advice too soon. Or, as a lot of young officers do, this is what I see, allow their ego to get in the way. You know. Alright, our enabling objectives for this one is we define de-escalation as it applies to law enforcement. We identify the signs and symptoms of an emotionally disturbed person. And we compare and contrast the benefits and disadvantages of de-escalation. And we identify the factors and decision to attempt de-escalation and describe the techniques for de-escalation of potentially dangerous situation. And identified some of the pitfalls in de-escalation. Do y'all have any questions?